Picture this. You're sitting at your kitchen table on a Sunday morning, coffee getting cold as you stare at a calculator and a pile of bills. $50. That's what you found in your budget after cutting out the premium streaming service, skipping lunch out twice a week, and deciding to brew your own coffee instead of hitting the drive-through. 50 measly dollars that you can realistically set aside each week without feeling like you're living on rice and beans. Most people would look at that amount and think it's not even worth bothering with. They'd spend it on something forgettable and move on with their lives. But what if I told you that this seemingly insignificant amount could completely transform your financial future in ways that would make your high school math teacher's head spin? My name is Alex, and I spent the first 15 years of my career in investment banking before walking away in my mid-30s. These days, I spend my time studying finance and wealth creation, not because I have to, but because I find the mathematics of money absolutely fascinating. I also mentor people who want to understand how wealth actually works instead of just hoping things will magically improve someday. If you've ever wondered why some people seem to effortlessly build substantial wealth while others work just as hard but never seem to get ahead, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button if this video helps you see money differently. Now, before we dive into the mathematics that schools conveniently forget to teach, let me ask you something that might sound ridiculous. When you think about building wealth, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture someone in an expensive suit making complex trades on Wall Street. Or perhaps you imagine inheriting money from a wealthy relative who conveniently leaves you their fortune. The truth is, wealth building has nothing to do with either of those scenarios. The real secret is so simple that most people dismiss it as impossible. Here's what actually happens when you understand the mathematics of compound growth. That $50 you can scrape together each week isn't just $50. It's the foundation of a financial machine that operates according to mathematical principles that have been working the same way for centuries. And the beautiful thing about mathematics is that it doesn't care about your background, your education level, or whether you understand complicated financial jargon. Math just works. Let's start with something that will probably surprise you. If you take $50 every single week and stuff it under your mattress for 20 years, you'll have $26,000. Not life-changing money, but certainly nothing to sneeze at. However, if you take that same $50 and put it to work in the stock market, earning an average return of 10% annually, something magical starts to happen. After 20 years, you won't have $26,000. You'll have over $74,000. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that most people never learn in school. If you can stick with this process for just 5 more years, bringing your total timeline to 25 years, that number jumps to over $118,000. 25 years of setting aside $50 per week, and you've crossed the $100,000 threshold that most people think is reserved for lottery winners and trust fund babies. Think about this for a moment. You've taken what amounts to less than the cost of a nice dinner for 2 each week and turned it into a 6-figure sum. The mathematics behind this transformation isn't complicated, but it is powerful beyond what most people can imagine. And the crazy part is that you didn't need to become a stock market expert or discover some secret investment strategy that only wealthy people know about. You just needed to understand how compound interest works and have the patience to let it do its job. Now, you might be wondering where that 10% return assumption comes from and whether it's realistic to expect that kind of performance over such a long period. This is where understanding historical market data becomes incredibly valuable. The S&P 500, which represents 500 of the largest companies in America, has delivered an average annual return of approximately 10% over the past several decades. Some years it's up 20%. Other years it's down 10%, but over long periods it averages out to around 10% annually. This isn't some get-rich-quick scheme or a guarantee that the future will look exactly like the past. But it is historical evidence that suggests patient investors who consistently put money into diversified stock market investments have been rewarded for their discipline. And the beautiful thing about index funds that track the S&P 500 is that you don't need to pick individual stocks or try to time the market. You're essentially buying a tiny piece of the entire American economy and letting compound growth do the heavy lifting. But let's address something that might be bothering you right now. 25 years sounds like forever when you're trying to build wealth. You might be thinking that you don't want to wait until you're old and gray to see meaningful results from your efforts. Here's where understanding the mathematics becomes even more powerful, because compound interest doesn't wait until the end to start working its magic. After just 5 years of investing $50 per week, you'll have accumulated over $16,000. That's already more than you would have by simply saving the money without investing it. After 10 years, you're looking at over $41,000. The growth accelerates because you're not just earning returns on your weekly contributions anymore, you're earning returns on all the previous returns that have accumulated over time. This acceleration effect is what mathematicians call exponential growth, and it's fundamentally different from the linear growth most people are used to thinking about. When you get a raise at work, your income increases in a straight line. When you save money in a regular savings account, your balance grows in a predictable, steady fashion. But compound interest grows exponentially, which means the growth gets faster and faster as time goes on. Here's a way to visualize this that might blow your mind. In the first 5 years of your $50 per week investment program, you'll contribute $13,000 and earn about $3,000 in returns. But in the final 5 years, from year 20 to year 25, you'll contribute the same $13,000 but earn over $24,000 in returns. Same contribution, dramatically different results, all because of the mathematical principle of compound growth. The reason schools don't teach this stuff is probably because it requires patience and delayed gratification, two concepts that don't translate well into standardized test scores or semester-based learning. But the mathematics is undeniable, and the results speak for themselves. Every wealthy person I've ever met understands these principles, even if they can't explain the mathematical formulas behind them. What makes this even more powerful is that $50 per week is just the starting point. As your income grows over the years, you can increase your weekly investment amount. Maybe year 3, you bump it up to $75 per week. Year 7, you're investing $100 per week. The compound effect applies to these increases as well, accelerating your wealth-building timeline significantly. But before you get too excited about the possibilities, we need to talk about the psychological barriers that prevent most people from ever starting this process. Because understanding the mathematics is only half the battle. The other half is developing the mental framework to stick with the plan even when it feels like nothing is happening. The first psychological barrier is what I call the invisibility problem. When you invest $50 this week, nothing dramatic happens to your life. You don't suddenly feel wealthy. Your bank account doesn't look dramatically different. You can't point to any tangible improvement in your lifestyle. This invisible progress creates a mental trap that derails most people before they ever build real momentum. So, think about it this way. When you go to the gym and lift weights for an hour, you don't walk out looking like a bodybuilder. You might not even feel significantly different than when you walked in. But if you keep showing up consistently for months, eventually people start noticing changes in your physique. The problem is that financial fitness works the same way, except the results are even less visible in the short term. After investing $50 a week for 6 months, you'll have contributed about $1,300 and maybe earned $100 in returns. That $100 in gains is real money, but it doesn't feel life-changing. It's certainly not enough to quit your job or buy anything meaningful. So most people look at their account balance, feel disappointed, and either stop investing altogether or convince themselves that they need to find a faster way to build wealth. This is where understanding the mathematics becomes your psychological anchor. When you know that your seemingly insignificant weekly contributions are following a mathematical formula that has worked for decades, you can push through the periods when progress feels non-existent. You're not hoping that things will work out. You're following a proven mathematical process that compounds wealth over time. The second barrier is what I call comparison paralysis. You start investing $50 per week. Then you meet someone who talks about investing $500 per week or buying rental properties or starting businesses. Suddenly, your $50 feels pathetic. You convince yourself that small amounts don't matter because other people are playing with bigger numbers. Here's what that thinking misses. The person investing $500 per week had to start somewhere too. Maybe they started with $50 per week 10 years ago, built their wealth, and now have more money to invest. Or maybe they have higher incomes but also higher expenses, so their actual savings rate isn't any better than yours. The mathematics of compound interest doesn't care how much other people are investing. It only cares about consistency over time. I've seen people abandon perfectly good investment plans because they felt embarrassed about the amounts they were contributing. They'd rather invest nothing than invest what they consider to be small amounts. This is like refusing to exercise because you can't run a marathon on your first day. The goal isn't to impress anyone with your weekly contribution amount. The goal is to harness the power of exponential growth over decades. The third barrier is the temptation to get fancy with your investments. Once people understand that $50 per week can turn into substantial wealth, they often convince themselves that they can accelerate the process by finding better investments. They start researching individual stocks, cryptocurrency, options trading, or whatever the latest investment trend happens to be. This is where most people sabotage themselves. They abandon a simple, proven strategy that would have made them wealthy in favor of complex approaches that require expertise they don't possess. It's like learning to drive on the highway before you've mastered parking in your driveway. The mathematics of compound interest works best when you keep things simple and consistent. Low-cost index funds that track broad market indices aren't exciting. They don't generate fascinating cocktail party conversations or make you feel like a sophisticated investor. But they give you exposure to hundreds or thousands of companies. They require zero research or stock-picking ability, and they have decades of historical data showing solid returns over long time periods. Sometimes boring is exactly what you want when you're building wealth. The fourth psychological barrier is lifestyle inflation, and this one catches people even when they're doing everything else right. You start investing $50 per week, and after a couple of years, you get a raise at work. Instead of increasing your investment amount, you upgrade your apartment, buy a nicer car, or develop more expensive hobbies. Your lifestyle expands to consume the additional income, leaving you with the same $50 per week to invest. This pattern prevents people from accelerating their wealth building even when their financial capacity improves. The mathematics of compound interest becomes dramatically more powerful when you increase your contribution amounts over time. If you can bump your weekly investment from $50 to $75 after a few years, then to $100, then to $150, you're not just adding more money to the pot. You're giving compound interest more raw material to work with over the remaining years. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. If you stick with $50 per week for 25 years, you'll end up with about $118,000. But if you increase your contribution by just $10 every 2 years, starting at $50 and eventually reaching $120 per week, you'll end up with over $200,000. Same time frame, same basic strategy, but the willingness to increase your contributions as your income grows doubles your final result. The fifth barrier is market volatility, and this is where most people's lack of mathematical understanding really hurts them. The stock market doesn't go up in a straight line. Some years it gains 20%, other years it loses 15%. When people see their investment account balance drop during market downturns, they panic and either stop contributing or pull their money out entirely. This reaction is completely understandable from an emotional standpoint, but it's mathematically disastrous. Market downturns are actually opportunities to buy more shares at lower prices with your weekly contributions. When the market eventually recovers, and historically it always has, you own more shares than you would have if prices had never dropped. Think about it this way. If you're buying $50 worth of an index fund every week and the price per share drops by 20%, your $50 now buys 20% more shares. When the market recovers to its previous level, those extra shares you bought at discounted prices are worth their full value again. Market volatility isn't your enemy when you're investing consistently over decades. It's actually your friend because it gives you opportunities to buy at lower prices. The key is understanding that temporary market declines are normal and expected, not signs that the entire financial system is collapsing. Since 1926, the stock market has experienced a correction of 10% or more about once every 2 years on average. But over that same time period, patient investors who stayed the course were rewarded with substantial wealth accumulation. This is why having a mathematical understanding of compound interest is so powerful. When you know that your $50 per week is following a proven formula for wealth creation, you can view market downturns as temporary noise rather than permanent disasters. You're not trying to predict what the market will do next week or next month. You're harnessing a mathematical process that works over decades regardless of short-term volatility. The sixth psychological barrier is perfectionism, and this one might surprise you. Some people get so caught up in optimizing their investment strategy that they never actually start investing. They spend months researching different index funds, comparing expense ratios, analyzing historical performance data, and trying to find the perfect investment approach. Meanwhile, the person who started investing in a basic S&P 500 index fund 6 months ago is already 6 months ahead in their compound interest timeline. Perfectionism becomes the enemy of progress because it delays the most important factor in wealth building, which is time. The mathematics of compound interest rewards people who start early much more than people who find the theoretically perfect investment strategy. Here's the truth that most financial advisors won't tell you because it doesn't generate enough commission fees. The difference between starting your $50 weekly investment plan today versus waiting until next year isn't just 52 weeks of contributions. It's the compound interest that those 52 weeks would have generated over the next 25 years. When you understand this mathematical reality, procrastination starts looking a lot more expensive. Let me give you some numbers that will make this crystal clear. If you start investing $50 per week today and continue for 25 years, you'll end up with approximately $118,000. But if you wait just 1 year before starting, keeping everything else exactly the same, you'll end up with about $106,000. That 1 year of delay cost you $12,000 in final wealth. $12,000 for the privilege of waiting 12 months to get started. This is why I always tell people that the best investment strategy is the one you actually implement, not the theoretically perfect one you spend months researching. The mathematics of compound interest is ruthless when it comes to time. Every week you delay starting is a week of compound growth that you can never get back. You can always optimize your approach later, but you can't go back in time and start earlier. Now let's talk about something that might change how you think about money forever. The concept of opportunity cost, which is basically the mathematical way of measuring what you give up when you make one choice instead of another. Most people think about the $50 they're investing each week as money they can't spend on other things. But that's backwards thinking. The real question is what you're giving up by not investing that $50. Consider this scenario. You decide to skip investing $50 this week and instead use that money to go out to dinner at a nice restaurant. That dinner costs you $50 today, plus the compound interest that $50 would have generated over the next 25 years. At a 10% annual return, that single $50 dinner actually costs you about $540 in future wealth. Suddenly, that meal doesn't seem like such a bargain anymore. This isn't about never enjoying yourself or becoming some kind of financial monk who never spends money on anything fun. It's about understanding the true cost of your choices, so you can make intentional decisions about where your money goes. When you realize that every $50 you spend today could be worth over $500 in 25 years, you start viewing purchases very differently. Maybe you still decide to go out to dinner because you value the experience more than the future wealth. That's perfectly fine, as long as you're making that choice consciously rather than just drifting through financial decisions without understanding their long-term implications. The goal isn't to optimize every single dollar to the point where life becomes joyless. The goal is to be intentional about the trade-offs you're making. Here's where this mathematical understanding becomes really powerful in practical terms. Once you grasp the opportunity cost concept, you start naturally gravitating toward choices that support your wealth-building goals. You don't need willpower to avoid unnecessary purchases because you can see exactly what those purchases are costing you in terms of future financial freedom. That expensive coffee habit that costs you $25 per week? You're not just giving up $25. You're giving up the $270,000 that money could become over 25 years if invested consistently. That premium cable package you never watch. It's not just costing you what you pay monthly. It's costing you decades of compound growth on that money. This perspective shift is what separates people who build substantial wealth from people who wonder where their money went at the end of each month. Wealthy people instinctively think about opportunity cost even if they can't explain the mathematical formulas behind it. They see money as a tool for creating more money, not just something to be spent on immediate gratification. But here's something interesting that happens once you start thinking this way. You don't become a miser who hoards every penny. Instead, you become much more selective about where you spend money. You stop wasting money on things that don't actually matter to you, which frees up more money to invest and also more money to spend on things you genuinely value. I know people who cut their monthly expenses by hundreds of dollars simply by becoming conscious of opportunity cost. They didn't feel deprived or like they were making major sacrifices. They just stopped automatically saying yes to purchases that weren't adding real value to their lives. The money they saved got split between additional investments and higher quality experiences they actually cared about. This brings us to something that might sound counterintuitive but is mathematically sound. Sometimes the best way to accelerate your wealth building isn't to invest more money. It's to increase your income so you have more money available to invest without reducing your standard of living. The mathematics of compound interest works on larger amounts just as effectively as smaller amounts, but with dramatically bigger results. Think about it this way. If you can figure out how to earn an extra $50 per week through a side hustle, freelance work, or negotiating a raise at your current job, you've just doubled your weekly investment capacity. Instead of investing $50 per week, you can now invest $100 per week while maintaining the same lifestyle. Over 25 years, that additional $50 per week turns into an extra $118,000 in wealth. The beautiful thing about focusing on income growth is that it creates a positive feedback loop. As you build wealth through consistent investing, you develop the confidence and financial stability to take bigger career risks, start businesses, or pursue opportunities that could significantly increase your earning potential. Meanwhile, people who never start investing remain stuck in financial survival mode, afraid to make career moves that could improve their situation. This is why I always encourage people to think about wealth building as a two-pronged approach. Maximize your savings rate by being intentional about expenses, but also maximize your income potential by continuously developing skills and exploring opportunities. The mathematics of compound interest amplifies both efforts, but it amplifies them much more dramatically when you have larger amounts to work with. Let's talk about something that most people get completely wrong about investing. They think it's about picking the right stocks or finding the next big opportunity that's going to make them rich quickly. But the mathematics tells a completely different story. Consistency beats performance almost every time when you're talking about long-term wealth building. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say you have two investors. Investor A puts $50 per week into a boring index fund that averages 8% annually for 25 years. Investor B tries to be clever, sometimes investing $100 per week when they think the market looks good, sometimes investing nothing when they're worried about volatility, and occasionally making big bets on individual stocks. Investor B might even have some years where they significantly outperform Investor A. But over 25 years, Investor A almost always ends up with more money. Why? Because consistency allows compound interest to work uninterrupted. Every single week, Investor A is buying more shares and reinvesting dividends. There are no gaps in the process, No periods where money sits on the sidelines waiting for better opportunities. No emotional decisions that disrupt the mathematical formula. Look, I get it. $50 per week doesn't feel like much when you're staring at it on paper. It's not going to change your life tomorrow or next month or even next year. But mathematics doesn't care about your feelings or your timeline. It just works, relentlessly and predictably, turning small, consistent actions into life-changing results. The person who starts this week with their measly $50 will be wealthy in 25 years, while the person who waits for the perfect moment or the perfect amount will still be waiting and still be broke. Your future self is counting on the decision you make right now. So make the one that leads to $100,000 instead of a lifetime of regret.